Hello there. Welcome to A Galaxy at War, a Star Wars in Review podcast. I'm your host, Bruce Burhand. I wanted to make a Star Wars podcast for quite a long time. I want to say last June was when I made the Twitter account for this, and it's almost February of 2019 now. And I could just never figure out how to make an actual Star Wars podcast. It originally started with me wanting to review the movies. And then I figured I might as well review the TV shows as well, since, the Clone Wars is coming back along with The Mandalorian and Resistance is currently going on and whatnot, plus the new movie trilogies. But I also like talking about lore. I know that I would be name dropping and referencing a lot of the books and comics, to the point where I figured I might as well make the podcast about all of this. And I love history, and I like Star Wars history, so it just kind of made sense. And this episode is going to be dedicated to what happened prior to The Phantom Menace. And just to get this out of the way, no, I will not be talking about every single thing that happened before The Phantom Menace. There are a lot of references that I will get to that just don't make sense to go in depth with them when they occur later in the series. So, for example, a lot of Old Republic era stuff is revealed in Rebels, which is the TV show. And I just didn't want to get in depth with it now when it would make more sense logically to talk about it there when it's revealed. Okay, now let's talk about the timeline for a second. The Expanded Universe, or EU, was what we used prior to Disney buying Star Wars. When Disney bought Star Wars, they wiped the slate on the timeline except for everything George Lucas pretty much created. So, like, the Clone Wars TV show stayed, and then all the movies obviously stood, and everything else got wiped out. So all the books and comics, all the video games, those all got erased, for better or for worse. And this was so that Disney could have something that coherently made sense, and they are extremely, extremely strict with that now. Pretty much if you make anything, it has to go through the story group and a whole bunch of other people before it's eventually approved, and then tweaked, and then it finally gets released, whatever it is. And so what Disney has done so far is essentially focus on the Rebellion era and then the sequel trilogy. So there's a lot of stuff that explains what happened after Episode 4 and what happened after Episode 6, but before Episode 7. And I imagine once Episode 9 comes out that they will be either fully going into the Old Republic era, or they will be filling out whatever happens during the sequel trilogy, or after, possibly. It wouldn't surprise me if they have books that take place after, depending on who lives and who dies. But that's just speculation. What we have this year is the Clone Wars is coming back, along with a whole bunch of other prequel content. The only problem is that most of this prequel content takes place after Episode 1. So what we have before Episode 1 are just a handful of comics, most of them one-shots. The Age of Republic comics are about 30 pages each, roughly. And let's just head right into it. We're going to be reviewing the Age of Republic Qui-Gon Jinn, Star Wars Volume 5, Yoda's Secret War, Star Wars Darth Maul, Age of Republic Darth Maul, and Age of Republic Special. There is a book titled Master and Apprentice, which is about Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi. We don't know how far back it's going to be, but it's actually written by Claudia Gray, and she's actually one of the best storytellers in Star Wars right now. Her books, Bloodlines, Leia, Princess of Alderaan, and Lost Stars is actually considered to be one of the best books in the entire canon. If anything major occurs in this book, I will make note of it for a future episode. But let's set the stage for the rest of the episode. So let's quickly run down how years work in Star Wars. Pretty much everything uses the Battle of Yavin as the center point. The Battle of Yavin is when the Death Star blew up. So everything either uses BBY for before the Battle of Yavin or ABY as after Battle of Yavin. So The Empire Strikes Back takes place 3 ABY, because that's 3 years after A New Hope. And then The Phantom Menace takes place 32 BBY. So it's 32 years before A New Hope. And all the comics are roughly around a couple months before The Phantom Menace. And we don't specifically know when Age of Republic Qui-Gon Jinn takes place, but I'm assuming it's just a couple of months before Phantom Menace, if not possibly a year. It wouldn't really surprise me if they're still in that little bubble. Master and Apprentice is going to be interesting solely because we don't know how far back it'll go. I would love to see it go back a decade or so, just so I can see young Obi-Wan Kenobi growing up with Master Qui-Gon. So they've been teasing childhoods kind of a lot recently. They showed Mace Windu's childhood and how he chose his purple lightsaber. Spoiler, it's actually not special. He just picked the crystal in the cave. But everything has been leaning towards more lore about the Jedi, and we're actually going to be heading into this with the Qui-Gon special. So the comic starts out on an alien planet where Qui-Gon saves a priestess from soldiers by escaping with Obi-Wan Kenobi. She's actually very disappointed that the Jedi would ever retreat. She believes that the Great Warrior's legend is a fraud, and she starts calling him a coward. It hurts Qui-Gon deeply, and upon returning to Coruscant, he vents to Master Yoda about how people just don't understand the purpose of the Jedi anymore. Nowadays, the Jedi are seen as soldiers and servants of politicians instead of defenders of the Force, which is another major point of the prequels that I think people personally forget. It's all about how the Jedi lost their way, and Qui-Gon's always been a big supporter of that. It's important to remember that the Jedi Order isn't that large, and while the majority of stories we get involve them in the Star Wars universe, throughout the rest of the galaxy, most people just hear tales of what they do. Fans tend to forget that while watching stuff like Clone Wars, you see them as generals. They're not supposed to do that. By fighting that war, they've already lost, and we'll actually come back to that later. So Qui-Gon decides to put his full trust into the Force and let it take him anywhere in hyperdrive, which is dangerous, and, it could land into a star or anything bad could happen. However, he lands on a vacant planet. It's strong with the plant life that has just light side of the Force in it. He willingly seeks out the giant hollow tree that's strong in the dark side and chooses to meditate there. Qui-Gon's always kind of been open to that type of thing. He believes that the Force has its dark side that you should still potentially listen to. And after a few trippy visions, he notices that the light side and dark side of the planet are coexisting perfectly. And going back to what I said earlier, Qui-Gon talks about how violence will lead to the dark side, and if left unchecked, the Jedi are going down a dangerous path. The Jedi here are hypocrites, and it will lead to their downfall, and that's one of the major themes of the prequels. This comic ends with another interpretation on balance, which is, in my opinion, what Disney is striding for a lot. You notice it in the sequel trilogy and in a lot of now canon storylines like this one. Pretty much he goes on to tell the priestess that she should compromise with her people and their enemies. He then tells Yoda that becoming too rigid is also a risk. The tree that won't bend will snap with the wind. Meanwhile, Yoda tells him that he just shouldn't bother with the dark side at all. The major reason why I'm going a little bit too in-depth with that is because this comic may talk about balance. However, Star Wars in general kind of talks about balance, even prior to Disney's arrival. In the films, we are quite literally following just the Chosen One's journey. His whole job is just to bring balance to the Force. If that's important enough to have the movie franchise around, I think it's important enough to have a discussion about. I don't think everyone's going to have the same opinion, and that's fine. I actually don't think there's a correct one. For example, Qui-Gon Jinn directly thinking violence isn't the answer is probably teasing the upcoming Clone Wars. And while others might want to take note of how in real life you aren't supposed to suppress anger and sadness and fear like how the Jedi claim, Anakin Skywalker is a great example of why the Jedi should be allowed to feel emotions like love and frustration and jealousy. We go to a therapist for these things in real life, yet you see Master Yoda, one of the oldest and wisest and most powerful Jedi, directly ignoring it and saying that we should just totally forget about it like it just doesn't even exist. Now, the original Darth Maul miniseries is essentially about how he kills a Jedi Padawan and becomes a true Sith, and some underworld dealings that kind of foreshadows what he does later, for example, when he pops up in cameos that I won't spoil, even though I'm assuming you guys have all seen some stuff. Pretty much the new one-shot shows Maul in the underworld of crime, again, And so that way we know that this takes place after his paperback. So pretty much this comic is just about how Maul has a vision of him being a Jedi. If you're wondering, yeah, he does have the really cool double blue lightsaber. He rejects it, though. And Sidious ends the comic by mentioning that while, yes, anger and revenge is a main part of being a Sith Lord, he's thankful of the light shown in Maul with his restraint. Obviously, his plan is going to take decades, and you can't simply rush into the Jedi Order and fight thousands of them alone. And clearly it works. We know Palpatine ends up taking over the entire galaxy, and he's just one Sith Lord by himself. Another comic I wanted to touch upon was Mace Windu's story in the Age of Republic special. In it, he takes down a warlord who takes children and indoctrinates them into becoming fighters for him. Personally, I believe that the point of the short story is to bring about the comparisons and trends found in Star Wars. If you've seen the new movies, I'm sure that you'll be like, oh, well, the First Order kidnaps young children and indoctrinates them. They're the bad guys. They're supposed to do that, just like how this guy does. Yes, but, well, the Jedi does as well. They gather younglings and raise them into the Jedi Order. Sure, they talk about peace instead of anger, but consider Anakin in Episode 1. He's considered far too old to even join the Jedi Order. Yoda's arc is a little weird. It kind of reminds people of the weird stories you'd get in the EU. Pretty much he follows the Force to a planet in the midst of a war, which shows these rocks that children are using to fight each other. Yoda decides to learn what is now known as stone power, and comes across the discovery that these stones aren't alive in the Force, but are literally alive. Yoda summons more mountains to pretty much bring compromise to both sides of the war. That's pretty much it, talking mountains. The rest of the comic is about Luke reading the story in Obi-Wan's journal and then traveling to the planet Now, where he sees that the rocks are less alive and whatnot. It's a little weird. And we've already discussed how Master and Apprentice is yet to come out yet, but we can still set the stage for more prequel lore. Hopefully this isn't too boring, but then again, if you lasted this long, you probably find this interesting as well. And a good example of material before Episode 1 would probably be the Old Republic. Some people, including me, think that the Old Republic is arguably better than anything George Lucas made. The games are typically what people go to as, oh, this thing. There are tons of comics and tons of books that discuss it, and the Tales of Revan and all this other stuff, but what we know now is shaky at best, and it's essentially pieced together from references in the new comics and the new books. And like I said earlier, I don't want to discuss all of it right now. I'm just going to discuss what makes more sense. So, roughly 6,000 years before the prequels, there was an unknown Jedi who believed the dark side had information worth learning. This Jedi was rejected, and that individual went rogue and essentially rebelled against the Order. Their understanding was that the dark side could unlock our true power and potential. In typical Jedi fashion, the individual wasn't killed, but exiled. Whoever they are, built and established the Old Sith. This period would be known as the 100-Year Darkness. Afterwards, this led to the Sith returning as an empire strong enough to rival the Old Republic. Both the Sith and the Jedi built gigantic super weapons using kyber crystals, the thing inside your lightsaber. Yes, even the Jedi did that, by the way. I just want to mention that. We all remember the Death Star, and we see it in all the movies destroying people and doing genocide and stuff, but the Jedi did that too, and they've used their super weapon multiple times. Their history is a bit problematic, but I am getting a bit ahead of myself. The Battle of Coruscant would later commence and result in the Sith building a shrine there. It was immensely powerful, and after a long war, the Jedi would eventually win it and build a temple back over it. That's the same temple we see in the movies. Coruscant's the capital where the Jedi headquarters are at, and this was all to try to conceal darkness, which is kind of essentially why Palpatine moved in there. He was like, hey, I just got to slip down underneath, and there's this ancient Sith shrine that I can gain more power and study it. And I'm really glad they investigated that more in the canon lore. We see that in some comics far later, obviously. After constant battles and skirmishes with the Sith and Mandalorians, I know you all love Boba Fett and his people, but I have to save that one for a future episode. That is a big plot line in Rebels. Just the realization of the black saber and all this other stuff. But the fall of the Old Republic commenced after all that, which may or may not have ended with the Jedi using a Death Star-like planet to destroy the Mandalorians' homeworld. All the Sith were defeated except for one, and the Republic reorganized themselves and became the Galactic Republic we know during the prequels. There was roughly 1,000 years of peace after that, and then we get to the mayhem that is the prequel trilogy and the Star Wars story that we know. But how did the Sith return if there was only one of them? Well, the only survivor I referenced earlier was Darth Bane. He had a trilogy of books that went way in depth, and those books are great, and I highly recommend them if you're interested in it, even though they're not exactly canon anymore. However, what is canon still is that Darth Bane established the rule of two. So there could only be two Sith, a master and an apprentice. He established the new Sith way through manipulation and deciding to hide in the shadows rather than wage an outright war against the Jedi. He noticed that all of the Sith infighting and civil wars would kind of make them vulnerable against the very organized Jedi Order. And eventually the Jedi found him and killed him. However, he did have an apprentice, so even though, we see in the movies, there's just no Sith. There's no way a Sith could come back. We killed them all. We know that, obviously, he had an apprentice, and then they kept going on, so forth and so forth. And it is quite fascinating because essentially how it works is the master pretty much schemes his way to try to get revenge against the Jedi, and the apprentice learns everything from the master. And once they're stronger than the master, they have to kill their master. And then the cycle just keeps continuing. So in a way, you're trying to get as far as you can for your generation before dying. Kind of like how real world works, but that's totally different. And we do know that, later on, the same way I'm talking about how the Jedi are hypocritical, you can make the same argument against the Sith. The new Darth Vader comic run that just ended went heavily into that, where essentially they talked about how, hey, the Sith aren't their former self. They're just obsessed with the Jedi, and they're obsessed with getting revenge. And maybe they should just kind of do their own thing and get their own empire and just be their own power and just learn the dark side. Which is fascinating to me. I think that would be really interesting. It reminds me of how the Old Republic MMO and all that other stuff worked. And we're not just getting obsessed one dynamic characters that are I gotta get revenge. Anyway, that long tangent leads us to the free trade zones. Episode 1 is notorious for having its entire plot line about taxation. It is kind of dumb. Some people like episode 1, but I'm kind of on the fence about it. I personally think it should have been a book, but George Lucas was like, nope, I have to do this really long, boring movie about taxes. And as an adult, I can kind of appreciate that, but it's still not a great movie. And it all boils down to this. The free trade zone areas throughout the galaxy are now eligible for taxation after the Galactic Senate passed a proposition. This greatly upset the Trade Federation, which caused them to blockade the planet of Naboo. Behind the scenes, Newt Gunray, who was the viceroy of the Trade Federation, engineered this conflict at the behest of Darth Sidious. And this was just so they could have a crisis in the Republic. Darth Sidious's plan was to be elected Supreme Chancellor. As we know, Darth Sidious is Sheev Palpatine. The current Supreme Chancellor, Finis Valrum, secretly dispatched 2 Jedis in order to meet with the Viceroy and resolve the dispute. And that's essentially leading up directly to episode 1. And I don't really want to make these episodes that long. The farthest I would probably go is maybe an hour, but I doubt I would ever reach that. Half an hour always seems like a decent point, if not lower. Right now I'm at 20 minutes, I'm noticing, and I like that length. And personally, there's a lot in Star Wars that we could continue talking about. As you can tell, I probably went off on a little rant once or twice. because there's just so much there that I'm just not going into. But instead of talking about, the core worlds or any of that other stuff right now, I think this is a really good stopping point. We've gotten all the way up with the movie. So I think next week I'm going to just be discussing The Phantom Menace. And I hope to do more lore and behind-the-scenes trivia and a bunch of other fun stuff too, or as fun as you can get about a movie about taxes. Anyway, I really appreciate you listening to me just talk about Star Wars. It's not as fun when you're in your bedroom by yourself in a microphone, but it's okay. I have another podcast called Beyond the Realm. Me and my girlfriend Hannah talk about true crime and paranormal events. You can follow me on Twitter at Local Alien Party. And I don't have a Patreon yet. However, it is something that I've been kind of wanting to do. I make YouTube videos, which, you could possibly be listening to it on this channel if you saw my link and you clicked on it. And I'm hoping to get back into that. I want to make some reviews pretty soon and some more gameplay videos. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a great time. And as always, may the Force be with you.